Hello, welcome to Boogaloo Radio. I'm Iain McNay from Cherry Red Records, and as there's a lot of new releases around at the moment, I thought I'd, for this programme, focus on the early days of Cherry Red. And Cherry Red started as a record label way back in 1978. Before that, we were a promotion company promoting gigs, mainly in Malvern in Worcestershire. And actually, it was in Malvern on New Year's Eve, 1977, in the Malvern Wine Bar, when Richard, one of my colleagues who helped promote the gigs, said, why don't we start a record label? And of course, that was a great time then. It was the beginning of so many independent labels. And he'd found a local band, a band called the Tights, who were actually from Cheltenham, up the road from Malvern. And we put them in a studio in Cheltenham, and they recorded this track, Bad Hearts.
I'll give you my heart, I'll give you my heart. I'll give you my heart, you know about heart. I'll give you my heart, I'll give you my heart. I'll give you my heart, you know about heart. Little house to dream it. Little house on its own my own. Little house to dream it. A harmony at home.
That was the Tights, Bad Hearts. And the singer Malcolm Orgy, that's his real name, was only 16 years old. And they were a good band. You could say they were punk in one way because they had that punk energy, but the songs were also pretty melodic. And they went on to do, I think, 5 tracks in total for Cherry Red. Now, the whole thing about Cherry Red was, it wasn't kind of trying to be a trendy label, it wasn't trying to be in a certain genre. We were a bit all over the place A&R-wise. And I kind of took risks insofar as, I'll give you an example. One of the releases we put out in the early days was by a band called Destroy All Monsters, which were from Detroit. And I read about this band in Sounds magazine that came out every week in those days. And the lineup was a very attractive looking woman called Niagara. There was Ron Ashton, who'd been in the Stooges, and there was Mike Davies, who'd been in MC5. So they had great pedigree. And they were just on a small label run by a local journalist called IDBI Records. Stands for I Don't Believe It Records. And I wrote to their manager stroke label guy, David Keeps, and said I'd read about the record they put out, because they put it out on their own in America on their own label. And I offered them $500 advance and said, I'd like to put the record out in the UK. Only thing was, I hadn't actually heard the record. But anyway, it all worked out. He sent me the tape for the track called Bored, plus a couple of B-sides. And we put the record out, and actually it went really well. And this is Bored by Destroy All Monsters. That was a track called Bored by a band called Destroy All Monsters. And they did actually come over to do a UK tour, which I helped organise. And even though they looked great in terms of the personnel, actually, when it came down to cutting it on stage, they were actually a bit of a disappointment, to be honest, and they didn't get great reviews. In fact, one headline, I think it was NME, the headline was Niagara Fails, which is a pun on Niagara, the girl's name who was a singer, and obviously Niagara Falls. So that kind of summed up the tour in one way. And another way, I was really happy to put the track out, and we did actually put out an album of tracks later on, because they were also an art band. They were quite influential in their own way. Another record we put out, which has a real story behind it, was by the Hollywood Brats. We did an album, and I'm going to play you the track we put out as a single, and then I'll tell you the story behind it afterwards. So this is Then He Kissed Me, which was, of course, written by Phil Spector. It's a cover of a track by the Crystals, and I think it's a great version. See what you think. Then He Kissed Me by the Hollywood Brats.
He walked up to me and he asked me if I wanted to dance. He looked kind of nice, and so I said I might take a chance. When he danced, he held me tight, and when he walked me home at night, all the stars were shining bright, and then he kissed me. Each time I saw him, I knew I wanted to see him again. I wanted to let him know he was more than a friend. I didn't know just what to do, so I whispered, I love you, and he said that he loved me too, and then he kissed me. He kissed me in a way that I'd never been kissed before. He kissed me in a way that I wanna be kissed forevermore. Knew he was mine, so I gave him all the loving I had. And one day he took me home to see his mom and his dad. Then he asked me to be his bride and always be right by his side. I felt so happy, I almost cried, and then he kissed me. Now he kissed me in a way that I'd never been kissed before. Kissed me in a way that I wanna be kissed forevermore. I knew he was mine, so I gave him all the loving I had. And one day he took me home to see his mom and his dad. Yeah. Then he asked me to be his bride and I'll always be right by his side. I felt so happy, I almost cried, and then he kissed me. Then he asked me to be his bride and always be right by his side. I felt so happy, I almost cried, and then he kissed me. And then he kissed me. And then he kissed me. Mwah.
And that was the Hollywood Brats, Then He Kissed Me. And actually that was a reissue, kind of, because the album came out in Scandinavia a few years earlier. And the story is, it's interesting. When the album came out originally, I was working at a company called Bell Records, a very successful record label. They had it was mainly pop acts. They had David Cassidy, Bay City Rollers, Gary Glitter, Barry Blue, all kinds of different pop acts. And the A&R guy at the time found the Hollywood Brats and said he'd like to sign them, but it didn't go down well in the powers in America. And the album never came out, even though there was test pressings for it. And I remembered this, and I saw them play at the time in a couple of clubs in London. And they were great live. They were obviously inspired by the New York Dolls, who I'd seen previously when they came over to London for the first time. The New York Dolls, of course, were, although they weren't a punk band, they kind of inspired the whole punk movement. And Malcolm McLaren did end up managing them before he formed the Sex Pistols. Anyway, I remembered this album by the Hollywood Brats, and I thought, I want to put it out on Cherry Red because I love the album. And so I got in touch with Andrew Matheson, who was a singer. It was Andrew Matheson, Casino Steel, Louis Sparks, who'd been in a band called The Queens, and then Brady joined them as guitarist. And he'd come out of a band called London SS, who were the forerunners of The Clash, actually. So it certainly had very good credentials, actually, the Hollywood Brats. And so the single came out, we put it as a single, Then He Kissed Me, and then we put out the album, and it still sells to this day, sells a few copies. And Andrew Matheson, the singer, has written a very amusing story all about the Brats. I say story, I haven't read it, but it's the book did quite well, got well reviewed. I like Andrew a lot, but I have to say, I don't know how true the stories are, although he'll swear they're all absolutely true. Another release in the early days of Cherry Red that was really significant was when we put out an album by the all-girl band, The Runaways. And in those days, all-girl bands were rare. I remember seeing a band called Fanny, who were an American rock band, all girls. When they came over into the UK a few years earlier. I saw the Runaways play as a support act at the Roundhouse, and although they weren't strictly speaking punk, they had a punk attitude. And of course, the main person, the singer was Sherry Curry, and the main person in terms of someone who went on to be successful was Joan Jett, who took over vocals when Sherry Curry left. And they made their last album was called And Now the Runaways, which hadn't got a European release because Mercury didn't want to release the album. So I tracked down the managers of the Runaways, that was Toby Mamis and Peter Leeds, who actually also managed the band Blondie at the time. I did a deal with them, and we put And Now the Runaways out in the UK, and I pulled this single off the album called Right Now.
I live for your fame.
Records right now by the Runaways. And there's actually a few films out about the Runaways. I think I've seen them all. There's one called Edge Play. There's one called Bad Reputation and one called Just the Runaways. And they're all worth watching in their own way. None of them are perfect. The one about one called Bad Reputation, actually thinking about it, is also about Joan Jett's career. So it's only partly about the Runaways. But they were seminal insofar as they were an all-girl band. They were formed by Kim Fowley, who's now departed, but he's quite a character, was quite a character. So the next record is really the one that changed things for me at Cherry Red, because up until that time, I was working in my flat in Wimbledon, running the label on my own. I had a couple of friends helping me out, but I was the only one really working there. And I just basically turned my dining room into an office, and that was the early days of Cherry Red. And of course, in those days, there was no internet, there wasn't even faxes. It was just, I was doing everything myself. And I was aware of this band called Dead Kennedys because they'd had their first single out called Uber Alice, California Uber Alice, on a Scottish label called Fast Product. But Fast didn't want to put the album out. And I got contacted by the band's European manager, the Dead Kennedys' European manager, Bill Gilliam, saying he'd heard decent things about Cherry Red. Would I like to come and talk to him about putting the Dead Kennedys album out? I thought, of course. I went to see him, and he gave me a track, Holiday in Cambodia, on a cassette, and it wasn't the finished version. And I played it. I thought, this is great. So I wanted to put the album out. He wanted $10,000. I didn't have $10,000. It was early days of Cherry Red. So I did a deal with Caroline Exports, which was the Virgin Records export division, and they lent me the $10,000 in return for a special price on export, and I think it was a 3-month exclusive on export. So I got the money, I signed the band, I went to San Francisco where they're based, met them all, and came back with the finished masters of the album, Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables. And this is the track that we took off the album, Holiday in Cambodia.
You want everyone to act like you. Kiss ass for your bitch so you can get rich, but your boss can switch her off you. Well, you'll work harder with a gun in your back for a bowl of rice a day. Slave for soldiers till you starve and your head is skewered on a stake. Now you can go where people are one. Now you can go
So that was Holiday in Cambodia by Dead Kennedys. And the band is still going. Jello Biafra, the singer, has left, but the other three are there. And I actually last saw them play in Oxford about 18 months ago. They were playing at a club there. And they're still great. That energy is still there. The great songs still come across. And my relationship with the band has had its ups and downs over the years, but we get on fine now. And it's always lovely to see them. I remember one day at Cherry Red, there was, we used to get post every day, and obviously, as I said earlier, this is way before the internet, so you sent cassettes to people if you wanted someone to hear your music. And there was a cassette arrived in the post, and it went to Michael Way, who was our then A&R man, and he listened to it. He didn't say much to me, but he said, before he went home, he said, "Iain, have a listen to this, see what you think, let me know in the morning." And what it was a band from Nuneaton called Eyelids in Gaza. And it was their whole album, their whole first album, Photographs as Memories. I thought it was great. And they'd even drawn the cover of the album on the front of the cassette. So it would almost look like a proper release. And the next day when I came and I said to Mike, "I love that." I said, "Let's try and sign them." So we did indeed sign them. We put the album out, as I said, Photographs as Memories. And this track was the first single, Invisibility.
Conflict, disdain, novel imposition, differing, separate, disquieting inhibition, you're shadowing projection, turning about a face, speaking words and songs left ravaged out of taste.
That was Invisibility by Eyelids in Gaza. And they still do the occasional gig. It's Martin Bates and Peter Becker. And Peter works as a graphic artist. And Martin, I think, still works as a full-time musician, and they play the occasional gig as Eyelids in Gaza. And they're still putting out music on their own records, so on their own label, which must be, they must have had about, 15 albums out now over the years. There was a band called Medium Medium, who again kind of reflected our policy at Cherry Red, which is really, we didn't really fit into any musical genre. We just put out records we really liked. And it was Michael Way and our man that found this band, Medium Medium. And they had a track which was, for us anyway, by far their most catchy track, which was called Hungry So Angry. And we put it out as a single. It didn't do much in the UK, but it got taken on by clubs in America. At that time, we were working with a club promotion company called Rock Pool, who are based in New York. And I'd been to see them, and we did a deal where we just shipped them over, I think, 50 or 100 copies of every single we thought could do well in clubs, and they'd mail them out. And this ended up getting in the top 20 of the Billboard dance chart, which actually meant something at the time. So the single sold quite well in America. We put the album out. The album did okay, but this for me was always a standout track. So here is Hungry So Angry by Medium Medium. That was Medium Medium with their track Hungry So Angry. Now, probably the person or the act I get asked most about when I meet people, I say I'm from Cherry Red, they say, tell me about Lawrence from Felt. What's he like? And Lawrence is an amazing character. We signed Felt in the early days of Cherry Red, and I remember I first saw them play on the floor of a pub in Acton, near where our office in Chiswick is now. And in those days, it was Lawrence, it was Maurice Debank, who was a classically trained guitarist, Nick Gilbert, Tony Race, Gary Ange joined shortly afterwards, and later Martin Duffy, who was also in Private on Screen, joined. And then there was Mick Lloyd, who unfortunately died, who was the bass player. And they were quite an enigma in one way. Their first single, called Index, was reviewed in Melody Maker, got Single of the Week, and it was from that Mike Allway found them. And we signed them for 5 albums, because Lawrence said he wanted to do 5 albums with us, and he said he would do 5 singles with us. And they built really album by album, track by track, single by single. They built their following and their mystique because they didn't play live regularly. And somehow Lawrence, I don't know how much he did it on purpose or how much he reflected his true character, but he was Maverick, but he was a mysterious Maverick, and you never knew what he was really up to. And he was focused on such perfection. And we'd get our album delivered or a single delivered, and we'd have to wait months because he hadn't got the artwork completely perfect. And to this day, he's the same actually. Anyway, this is the first single we put out by Felt, Something Sends Me to Sleep.
The times you spent there, I thought you weren't coming back. Then you those stones, yeah, I don't know how. I saw wide eyes and kids, so I said to you, I said I might. We know it's wrong, but hell is right. I told you so, I think you knew just what it is we're coming to. I told you so, believe me now, you cannot see what I can see. I let you down, but you're getting higher and higher. It's hard to take, but you're 300 years old today. You trace me, I'll be miles away. Think you know why I'm not staying here. I told you so, in the green light of your schemes. Something sends me to sleep. I don't know what it is, I don't know what it is. You should be watching me. Been asleep for years. It's just that we preserve. It's no big deal, you know. I couldn't help realizing that the French horizon, they're beyond the horizon. In the skies horizon, computer, come on.
That was Something Sends Me to Sleep by Felt. Now Felt left Cherry Red after 5 albums and they signed to Alan McGee's Creation Records, where they did a further 5 albums and 5 singles. So altogether they did 10 albums and 10 singles in 10 years. And then he formed a band called Denim and they did 3 albums. And now he has a band called Go-Kart Mozart, who are signed to Cherry Red. And obviously we still work with Lawrence through that. And he's still the same Lawrence, but there's something about him we all love. He's infuriating, but we love him. So we still work with him and we work in Lawrence way, in Lawrence time, and we've learnt that. It's the only way you can do it, really. So if you have some time and you like what we played on Felt, check out Denim and Go-Kart Mozart as well. They're different, but they're also really good. Now, the Marine Girls were a band from Hatfield, all-girl band from Hatfield in England. And musically, they were quite minimal. And to start with, there was 4 of them. There was Alice, Jane, and Tracy. And it's terrible, but I forgot the name of the 4th person. I might remember it before the end of the programme. And they did an album which was on a very, very low budget, which got reasonable critical acclaim in the weekly music papers. And so Cherry Red signed them, recorded a 2nd album, and the single we took off the 2nd album was On My Mind.
So happy, feeling so sad. Only smile now when you're with me. She's got it bad. I look around for someone new, wasting her time, but no one can compete with you. That's a bad sign. My friends, I don't hear what they say. We're talking to you. My heart's a million miles away. What can we do? And I don't know whether to laugh or cry. Please don't ask me. But I know I kiss my heart goodbye. It's easy. We tell her she's wasting her time, but still she finds. Another day without you, and I don't know why I bother thinking about you. I see you, should I run and hide? Will I get home and slam my door and shut the world outside? We tell her she's wasting her time, but still she finds. You're my mind, oh my mind, oh my mind, oh my
That was On My Mind by the Marine Girls. And I went to see them play, I think, 3 times, and they were shambolic, but they had an appeal and they had some remarkably good songs. And of course, the person that has the profile now is Tracy Thorn. She wasn't actually the lead singer to start with, it was Alice, who was Alice Fox. She was the lead singer. But Tracy's voice was the strongest voice. And she ended up teaming up with Ben Watt, who was also signed to Cherry Red at the time, and they formed Everything But the Girl. Everything But the Girl was it's quite a well-known story, but they got the name from a second-hand furniture shop in Hull, where they were both at university. And we did this single on Cherry Red, which was a cover of a Cole Porter song called Night and Day.
Night and day, you are the one. Only you beneath the moon and under the sun. Whether near to me or far, no matter, darling, where you are, I think of you night and day. Day and night, why is it so that this longing for you follows wherever I go? In the roaring traffic's boom, in the silence of my lonely room, I think of you night and day, night and day, deep in the heart of me. There's an oh such a hungry yearning burning inside of me, and this torment won't be through till you let me spend my life making love to you, day and night, night and day. This torment won't be through until I spend my life with you, day and night, day and night, day and night, day and night.
That was Night and Day by Everything But the Girl. And it was almost a hit because it got really good radio play and it got in the lower reaches of the charts. But maybe the Cherry Red muscle in those days wasn't strong enough to deliver an actual hit. So sadly they left Cherry Red and they signed to Blanco Negro through Warner Brothers, and they ended up having many hits and many chart albums over the years. There was a band from Manchester called The Passage. They were led by a guy called Dick Witts, very interesting character, and they'd been previously signed to Virgin. And I know that Michael Wayne, at the time, he was very drawn to them. He thought they were really good, and they were synth pop with a difference. And we went on to do 2 albums with them, and also I think it was 3 singles. And I'm going to play now the first single, which again got a lot of radio play and maybe could have been a hit with a bit more profile. XOYO.
If music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it.
No more, no need for gents and ladies. No need no more for breeding babies. Taking them so redesigned. No more divide the body and mind. Not a duty, just an action you'll enjoy. For any boy and boy, girl and girl and girl and boy. Rub up the rules on who and how can procreate. X O Y O triple X sex mosaic. O Y O triple X sex mosaic. X 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 O Y O triple X sex mosaic. Renegades! No time, no more for nature laws. Who dreamt them up for us, commons laws? No need, not here, not now, for can't be done. Taking your figure out for a ride is much more fun. All they've told you up to now, put it in reverse. For any girl and girl and boy and boy and boy and girl. Forget about who and why and how and where and what you take. X O Y O triple X sex mosaic. 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 Natural selection in need of some correction. Natural selection and due for disconnection. Don't be normal, just relax. Take your time, lie on your back. Need of some correction, and then when you've done, natural selection. Turn over quick and have more fun. And due for disconnection. No more, no need to save the last dance for heaven. Antisocial, sat on shelf, talk to yourself forever. Big G's choreography, you sit, watch time fly by. It'll whip the air and spin the mind, much more divine. Not a duty, just an action you'll enjoy. For any boy and boy, girl and girl and girl and boy. Rub out the rules on who and why and what can procreate. X O Y O triple X sex mosaic. 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 X O Y O triple X sex mosaic.
Enough. No more. It's not so sweet now as it was before.
That was The Passage and XOYO. And it was Dick Witts who led the band, and he went on to do other musical projects. And he's now a university lecturer and also an author. He's written really good books about Nico and the Velvet Underground. He's a very good writer. Now, Adrian Sherwood was another character who I met in the early days of his musical career. And he's well known now as a producer and a remixer. And I just thought that what Adrian was doing was very interesting at the early days of his career. And so we signed him for a deal to make 6 albums. They're all very different. And the first album we put out was by Creation Rebel, and the track is Love I Can Feel.
Something I earned.
was Love I Can Feel by Creation Rebel, produced by Adrian Sherwood. And it's worth looking out for Adrian's projects. He has his own label called On You Sound, and he's always up to really interesting things. Now, the Monochrome set had been going a long, long time. The main two people are Andy Warren and Bid, and there was also Leicester Square. And Andy Warren and Leicester Square were originally in Adam and the Ants. They were the Ants, or part of the Ants. And then they left and they formed the Monochrome set with Bid. And they were also originally signed to Virgin. I think they had 2 albums on Virgin. And we all really liked them at Cherry Red. Not only the music, but they were also great characters. And we put out a couple of albums, and this is the single that we took from the first album, and it's called The Mating Game.
Kiss, lick, stroke, flick, quiver, quiver, shake and shiver, baby, wow. Unclasp, flop, gasp, sopping, there's no stopping now. Blonde, brunette or redhead, black, yellow or white, they're all the same in the mating game, but I can't complain now. Squeeze, suck, pinch, pluck, wobble, grab and gobble, darling moan. Unzip, ooze, drip, dippy, wet and slippy groan. Blonde, brunette or redhead, black, yellow or white, they kiss the same in the mating game, but I can't complain now. Doggy, shudder on your bended knees. Thrust, pump, spurt, slump. Siggy, puff, cough and wheeze. Blonde, brunette or redhead, black, yellow or white, they taste the same in the mating game, but I can't complain now.
That was The Mating Game by Monochrome Set. And lyrically, they were always fascinating, Monochrome Set. And I saw them play last about 2 years ago in the 100 Club in Oxford, and they're still really good live, and they're still making new albums too, which they generally put out on their own label. In keeping with the diversity of Cherry Red, we actually did sign a punk poet, and his name was Attila the Stockbroker, and he's also a musician, but he did some which was just poetry and some music which lyrically was also very strong. And we did an EP with him, and the EP was called Cocktails, and here's the first track.
Friday night in Baker Street, look at the state of that. Think you're in a fashion show with your peacock hat. Going to a West End club, £5 on the door. Just another trendy cocktail, disco mega bore. You sip cocktails while you sit there and pose. You sip cocktails till they come out your nose. You sip cocktails, you get on my wick. You sip cocktails, you make me sick. You sit there with your peacock friends and scan the place for stars. You're a ligger and a parasite for each of the cocktail bars. You look right and you dress right and you know just how to be. But I don't like the way you look, so stay away from me. You sip cocktails while you sit there and pose. You sip cocktails till they come out your nose. You sip cocktails, you get on my wick. You sip cocktails, you make me sick. The music press about the hit places to go. You write for the music press about the hit people to know. You think you're their star journalist, but you're just a clapped out hack. And when the fashions change again, you're gonna get the sack. You sip cocktails while you sit there and pose. You sip cocktails till they come out your nose. You sip cocktails, you get on my wick. You sip cocktails, you make me sick. Drunk all you can drink, it's off back home to bed. Kid outside says got 10p, you turn away your head. Across the road his mates sniff glue, they've got nowhere to go. But poverty's so boring, darling, you don't wanna know. You sip cocktails while you sit there and pose. You sip cocktails till they come out your nose. You sip cocktails, you get on my wick. You sip cocktails, you make me sick. You make me sick. You make me sick. You make me sick.
That was Attila the Stockbroker and Cocktails. And Attila is still working remarkably after all these years. He's got his circuit. He works a lot in Europe, a lot in Germany, in Holland, and he's very popular there. He still also puts his own records out, and we did actually publish on Cherry Red a time ago his autobiography, which again is a really good read. He's very political in his lyrics, and I have to say I don't always agree with his politics, but Attila is a fine chap, and I love the way, like I always do with the Monochrome set and other acts we've been involved with, the way they keep going and they keep doing what they love, which I think is so important in music. It's not all about having big success. It's just making a living out of what you love, whatever way you can. Now, Joe Crow. This is probably one of my personal favourites of the tracks from the early days of Cherry Red. And Joe Crow came out of a band, a Birmingham band called the Prefects. And they ended up pretty much as the Nightingales, Robert Lloyd's band. And he did stay with the Nightingales for a time and played on some of the early singles. And he wrote this track called Compulsion, which I still think is a brilliant track. And it's actually covered by Martin Gore from Depeche Mode, who put it on one of his solo projects. And I don't know what happened with Joe. I don't know if he's still doing music now or not. But here's this track, and it's quite a long track, over 5 minutes, Compulsion.
Charms in limited supply and refusing to stretch that indefinable nothing. So what keeps pushing you? Finding the right words can be a problem. How many times must charms in limited supply, under threat of extinction. That indefinable nothing. So what motivates you? Finding the right words can be a problem. How many times must it be said? There's no plan. It had to happen. Gotta move on sometime, and it's about time. By putting one foot in front of another and repeating the process. Cross over the street, you're free to change your mind. Strength through diversity, couldn't put it more plainly. Gotta move on sometime. 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 Gotta move on sometime.
That was Compulsion by Joe Crow. There's a guy called Thomas Lear, and he was Scottish, but he lived in London. And I first heard of him when he made an album with Robert Rental called The Bridge, which came out on Mute Records. And then he released his own single called Private Plane, which he put out himself, which got pretty good critical attention. And then we signed him to Cherry Red, and we did one album, I think one EP, and a couple of singles. And this single I love. It's called All About You by Thomas Lear.
Sitting there beside me, all alone. Took so long to find you, a face unknown. But I'm not supposed to see you. I'm not supposed to care. I'm not supposed to tell you what love is all about. Love is all about. Love is all about. Is all about you.
I'm not supposed to tell you what love is all about. Love is all about. Love is all about. Is all about you. It's all about you. It's all about you. Must believe it's true. It's all about you. It's all about you. It's all about you. Must believe it's all about. It's all about you. You must believe it's all about you. It's all about you. You must believe it's all about you. It's all about you. You must believe it's true.
That was All About You by Thomas Lear. And the single got a lot of attention, a lot of radio play, and bigger entities than Cherry Red got to hear, obviously, Thomas, and see his talent. And unfortunately, we lost him, and he signed to ZTT, the home of Frankie Goes to Hollywood and many other big acts. And he did some solo projects there, and he also recorded with Claudia Brucken as an act called ACT, A-C-T. They made some fine records, and of course Cherry Red has worked with Claudia Brucken and put her last 2 albums out, which I've also really enjoyed. Of course, All About You was also on Pillows and Prayers, which was a Cherry Red sampler, which is still talked about in certain circles. Now I'm now going to play 2 tracks back to back. I've talked about the artist before. I'm going to play Tracy Thorn's Plain Sailing and Ben Watt's Some Things Don't Matter.
Meetings arranged, they say never work out. I say we've proved them wrong without doubt. I can't remember now just what we said, though I never could have guessed what lay ahead. As I ran towards you up the stairs, did a voice in my ear cry beware. Even now I'm surprised to recall such a short time it took me to fall, pretending that my heart's still elsewhere, when in truth I had long ceased to care. For one I thought I'd never replace, till in my heart you left in no space. You say you wonder what was it I saw. I say, oh, I don't recall anymore. My first impressions have been left behind, replaced now by feelings of more lost in kind. Sure that you know, but you never can tell. When I think I understand you so well, shakes me that you were a constant surprise, or so you appear in my eyes. Tempting to think now if we're all the plain sailing, old enough now to know there's no such thing.
This boy breezes in from the southwest. This boy sees his days in the Middle East. This
boy eased his way up the silver Thames. But what is that when this boy, he needs love? He needs love. This boy thought he had found his girl. This boy ought to have kept that girl. This boy caught up in the wheels of fate. This boy deserves, oh, this boy, he needs love, an everlasting love. He needs love. Oh, this boy, he knows how to feel the blood in his heart run strong as cochineal. This boy, oh, he knows what's real, so give him love, an everlasting love. Give him love. Oh, this boy, he's got a heart of gold, and gold's the most precious thing you could ever hold. And if his heart is made of that, what need more be told? Just give him love, an everlasting love. Give him love. This boy breezes in from the southwest. This boy sees his days in the Middle East. This boy eased his way up the silver Thames. But what is that this boy deserves? Oh, he needs love, an everlasting love. Give him love. Oh, give it to him. He needs it now. An everlasting, 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 everlasting love.
So that was Plain Sailing by Tracy Thorn, followed by Some Things Don't Matter by Ben Watt. And those tracks were both off their solo albums. As I said earlier, we signed Tracy because she'd been in the Marine Girls, who we were involved in. And then we had Ben on a solo contract. And I remember the first time I saw Ben, it was at a club called Snoopy's in Richmond. And I think it was only his second ever gig. He was a support act. And he was very nervous, but he had some great songs. And it was just obvious, to me anyway, that he would be successful in time. And of course, both of them found big success with Everything But the Girl. And their solo albums, again, got critical acclaim and still sell quite well all those years later. Sometimes people just walk into Cherry Red, and they walk in with, in those days it was a tape. These days It might be they just give us a CD, and you've got no idea really how they found us or where they've come from. And one day, this would have been in the early 80s, two Greek twins walked into Cherry Red, and they were living in London, but they were Greek, and their English wasn't brilliant. And they brought in a demo of a track called If She Doesn't Smile. And we all loved it. And we put them in the studio, and they made a master. The budget was limited, so the B-side of the master was the A-side without the vocals, and they decided to call themselves Fantastic Something. And this track got so much airplay, but it didn't really sell. Such a shame, because it was such a good track. Anyway, I'll play it now, see what you think. If She Doesn't Smile by Fantastic Something.
Sunny day and I'm looking for her, you see. Where can she be? When we play, she makes me love her, you see. With her I'll be free. There, I saw her again. There, I know it's my turn. Can't be bad, I'm dreaming, beginning, she sees me. Ask her be, where is my honey, you know. I've got my heart to show. Can't you see, I'm feeling lonely, it shows. I hope this time she knows. So glad I found her, love hers is with me. Oh girl, you are my sunshine. That bird came at the right time. Don't go away, don't go away.
That was the Fantastic Something, If She Doesn't Smile. And it's funny how memories come to you. I'm just remembering this as I talk about them. And it got a lot of airplay, as I said, and it got attention from major record companies. And I remember Seymour Stein, who had a label called Sire Records and was vice president of Warner Brothers. I remember him and three other Warner Brothers executives, all American, coming into our Cherry Red office at that time in Bayswater, because they'd heard Fantastic Something, And they said, what else have you got? And we were playing all these other things we were involved with. And Fantastic Something did end up signing to Warner Brothers. Seymour did sign them. And they had an album, and I have the album at home. I like the album, but it didn't really do anything. And then, as is the case with major labels, if you don't do something fairly quickly, unfortunately, they tend to drop the axe. But the two, Vice was their surname. I can't remember their Christian names, but the two twins have done records subsequently. And if you hunt around on the internet, you can find them. And I have them both at home, and I like them. They're good records. They're good albums. Now, Kevin Hewitt was on Factory Records, and he had an album out on Factory, and Factory were kind of one of the bee's knees, if you like, of record labels. They had a terrific reputation. They'd had, obviously, Joy Division and New Order and other pretty big acts. And they really liked him, and they worked with him but didn't really get the sales they needed. So in the end, they let him go. Kevin came to us, and I just loved his voice. I still love his voice. He's still making records. And this is a single we put out. It's called Feathering the Nest, from the album Such Hunger for Love.
Feathering the nest, darling. The nest with a view of limited horizons. Small world wise and it's the little woman at home. Isn't it home anymore? Back at the ranch, I pace the floor. I'm sure that it was my fault. Big mistake, wasn't it?
That was Kevin Hewitt and Feathering the Nest. And Kevin did go on to make an EP for us with Adrian Borland. Adrian Borland first had a band called The Outsiders, and then he had a band called The Sound. And Adrian was so talented, and I knew Adrian quite well because he lived near me in Wimbledon. I knew his parents as well. But he was a tortured soul in the end, unfortunately. Well, unfortunately, it was terrible. He killed himself in the end. But he made these 4 tracks with Kevin, which I think are brilliant. And I have played them on Boogaloo before, one of them anyway, and I'll probably play them again in a subsequent show. Now, it's so true that every track for me on Cherry Red, especially the early days, has a story. And the story of the next track, I've told before, but I'm sure most of you haven't heard this story. And I remember having a dinner one night with our German licensee at the time at Cherry Red and dropping him off at his hotel, driving back to my flat. I lived in Primrose Hill then, and discovering I had 2 flat tyres. And this is obviously before the days of mobile phones, and it was a cold, wet night, so I was a little bit down, thinking, oh dear, this isn't a good end to the evening. And I went off and I called the AA rescue service. I came back to the car, and it was shortly before midnight, and I switched on the radio. It was a John Peel show, and I heard this track. It's a Fine Day by Jane.
It's a fine day, people open windows, they leave their houses just for a short while. They walk by the grass and they look at the grass, they look at the sky. It's going to be a fine night tonight, it's going to be a fine day tomorrow. Da, 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 Sitting in this field, I remember how we were going to sit in this field, but never quite did. Rain or appointments or something. Sitting in this field, I remember how we were going to sit in this field, but never quite did. Rain or appointments or something. Rain or appointments. It's a fine day, people open windows, they leave their houses just for a short while. They walk by the grass and they look at the grass, they look at the sky. It's going to be a fine night tonight, it's going to be a fine day tomorrow. We will have salad.
That was It's a Fine Day by Jane, and the song was written by Edward Barton and performed by Jane. And I loved it, and I thought, I want to check this out to see if it's on a proper label or not. And I rang up John Walters, who was the producer for John Peel, who I also knew, and he gave me the phone number of Edward Barton, who had written the song and put it out. I rang Edward, and I said, I love it, can I put it out in Cherry Red? And we did a deal, and we put it out. And again, it wasn't a hit. It got loads of airplay. It wasn't quite a hit. But it was a hit many moons later when Pete Waterman from PWL produced a cover version of it called by an act called Opus 3. And that did become a big hit around the world. And I actually talked to Edward Barton last week because he got in touch and he said, I've got some new tracks by Jane, and he sent me 5 new tracks which I'm in the process of listening to. And let's see, maybe there's a future for Jane on Cherry Red. We'll see what happens. As I said earlier, you never know who's going to walk into the door. And there was a manager of a band called Redbox who walked into the Cherry Red office. This is obviously many moons ago. And he brought the finished master with him of a track called Chenko. And Mike, the A&R guy, had left by that time. There was John Hollingsworth, was then the A&R man. He was out. And he had an intern working there from America, Kerry McCarthy, who was helping us out. And he played this track by Redbox to Chenko, to Kerry. I'm going to play the track now. Here's the track. That was Chenko by Redbox. And I've just finished telling the story, and she loved it. She kept playing it, and she drove everybody in the office mad playing this track, saying, "This is brilliant. You've got to you've got to sign this band. And we all agreed it was brilliant. Now, Iain, I got friendly with Iain afterwards, and I got to really like him. But at that time, he wasn't easy to do a deal with. He wanted too much money, and I said, well, we can't afford that. You know, we're independent, we haven't got deep pockets. And before I always said, I must have the rights to an album. I won't just release a single. But the office was so positive. They said, you've got to get it, you've got to get it. So in the end, we did a deal. John Hollingsworth and I did a deal with him whereby we put the single out, and if it was a hit, top 40, we got an option to an album. So I thought, well, that's a fair compromise. We put it out, it got loads of airplay. And again, it wasn't a hit. It's a shame because it was a great track. But because of what we did, again, Seymour Stein from Warner Brothers heard it. And I got quite friendly with Seymour by that time. You know, Seymour has a great history. He signed people like Talking Heads, Madonna, so many huge acts. And you know, he had great ears. And he was American, but he had a flat in London, was in London quite a lot, and I'd see him every now and again. Anyway, so he wanted to sign them, and I helped him sign them because I knew that they didn't really have a future on Cherry Red. We had no more options that were left that were valid. And they went on to have actually 2 quite major hits. One was In America, which was top 10. The album didn't do much, which came out on Warner's, but we did actually put a Red Box album out on Cherry Red a few years later. And I think they've recently done another album as well. And I still think it's a great track. I'd been aware of a band called In Embrace for a time. They were signed to Glass Records, and I was friendly with Dave Barker at Glass Records. And I loved the vocals. Gary Knight was the vocalist, and he's the songwriter. I really liked his voice. And he wrote for me, he wrote pop songs. They weren't necessarily big commercial pop songs, but they were pop songs. And so I was really happy when I had a conversation with Gary, and he said that Glass were fine. I never liked to steal acts from other independent labels, so I never went round, and the Cherry Red policy was never to go around and try and take other people's acts. But Dave Barker had done what he felt he could with them at Glass Records, so he was fine for them to sign with Cherry Red. And they did 2 singles. I love both of those singles. And this one is called Shouting in Cafes.
Conclusion, we grab cure.
track was Shouting in Cafes by In Embrace. And Cherry Red we mainly signed British bands, but we also liked signing bands from other countries. And John Hollingsworth, who was then our A&R man, he found this band from Slovenia called Lieback. And they were from Slovenia, but they were living in a squat in Hampstead in London at the time. And their music was veering towards industrial. It was quite hard music. And they were interesting because they had a very military image. When they went on stage, they almost looked like soldiers. And they did all their affairs in a very military, logical way. And John was very keen to sign them. And the band wouldn't sign unless I went to have an evening at their squat in Hampstead, and I had to sign their manifesto. I had to read and sign their manifesto. And it was a kind of a political manifesto, but I read it, I was okay with it. I was okay signing it. And the important thing is that they were interesting band, and I said, we're going to work hard to see what we can do with you in the UK. So we ended up signing them. I went to see them play several times. They were very loud, I have to say, and you'd come out of there and it was like, wow, you'd had an experience. So, well, I hope you enjoy what I've done today. As I said, I've really delved into the early days of Cherry Red, the very formative days, and played the standout tracks. For me, it's always a personal thing, music, as I'm sure it is for you guys that are listening as well. And I've played the tracks that I love and were important in the formative days in different ways for Cherry Red. And I hope you've enjoyed the show. Thank you for listening. And this is the single we put out called Der Liebe.
Ein Schauspieler!